The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to NAVSO mini-series, our webinar series on getting your board on board. Today, we're talking about part 3, getting your board in the leadership position, and I'm really excited to be your host today. I just want to talk to you a little bit about how you can participate in today's webinar. Here you're going to see on the slide a control panel. Just make sure that you have your audio section dialed in, whether you're using your phone or computer audio, and make sure that toggle button is the right one. Also, you'll be able to ask questions to our panelists today using the question and answer section that you'll find on your control panel. So feel free to send those throughout the webinar. We will have a live Q&A section at the end of today's presentation. And also, I have attached the slides today. You should see that under your handout section. So if you want to download those and save those and write some notes. If you don't see that section, you may be using just an outdated version of GoToWebinar. Feel free to send me a note at kelly@navso.org, and I'll send those over to you right after we finish today. So if you could just go to the next slide. As I mentioned, this is part of our board webinar mini-series. We talked about part 1 back in June about what matters most. So some basics about how you set up the board and functionality with leaders from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund and NAVSO. Part 2 was a founder's perspective over the years. I hosted a conversation with Bonnie Carroll from TAPS. And she shared what she's learned over the 25 years of being a founder and leader of her organization. And then today I said we're talking about part 3. All of these series can be accessed through the NAVSO portal once we're finished. So feel free to share them with your teammates and go back and see the other series that you may have missed. And feel free to send us any questions if you have trouble accessing any of those. As always, we like to hear your insights and your participation on social media. So share what you think. And let us know, and don't forget to tag us using the hashtag NAVSOwebinar. This is a little bit about me, the Chief Operating Officer at NAVSO. We formed NAVSO over 5 years ago to help educate and equip nonprofits to be more successful at serving veterans and military families. And it's my honor to have been along for the ride throughout this journey. But it's really not about me today. We have some amazing presenters that I'm really excited to introduce to you today. So our first speaker is Jim Taylor. He's the Vice President of Leadership Initiatives at Boardsource. And Jim is really going to talk to us about his efforts and what he's using to train others to position nonprofit boards for stronger leadership using diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we are just thrilled to have him share with us. You can see he has had a wealth of experience in a career and previously served as the working for Capital One in community relations and in Fairfax County, also in a leadership position really focused on public-private partnerships. So we're looking forward to hearing him speak today. And our second panelist is Paul Daugherty. He is the president and CEO of Philanthropy West Virginia. And he is a leader both at his own organization, participates in boards as well, and he's really focused on bolstering rural communities in West Virginia. Much like NAVSO, he runs an organization of lots of different organizations, so his board perspective is vast in knowledge, and I certainly have the privilege of being a presidential leadership scholar with Paul this year and next year. So thank you to you both for joining us today, and we are excited to listen to your insights. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim, and don't forget to share your questions in the questions box as we go along. So thanks so much for joining us, Jim. If you want to come up on your webcam, we'll be ready to turn it over to you. There you are. Thanks, Jim, for joining us.
Great. Thank you, Kelly, so much for the invitation to be with all of you today. As Kelly mentioned, my name is Jim Taylor, and I'm the Vice President of Leadership Initiatives at Boardsource. And I'll say just a few words about who we are and what we do at Boardsource in just a second. But before I do that, I just wanted to just note that I think the theme of today's session, getting your board on board and getting your board in a leadership position, is so important today and so resonates with our mission at Boardsource. When I think about where we are today in terms of the unique role that nonprofit organizations can play with regard to bridging divides in society, and sort of brokering solutions. I think this is just an important moment to have the conversation we're going to have today, particularly as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Boards have to be operating at their best as leaders, and what I want to talk about today is the vital importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion as guiding principles, how boards can be should be composed in terms of their composition, in terms of race and ethnicity and lived experience and skill sets. I will talk some about some of the national data that we have compiled at BoardSource, as well as some strategic steps around board recruitment and retention as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll share some experiences and conversations I've had in the field, conversations that in some cases have been kind of uncomfortable, but I do want to give you a real sense of the kinds of conversations that come up and what I see as learning opportunities for everyone when these conversations come up. And then I'll close out my section of this conversation today with some recommendations for board members and some tools and resources that I think can be helpful to all of you. So let's start with a little bit of an overview of BoardSources Vision. BoardSource is a national organization. We provide tools and resources and research to increase board effectiveness and to strengthen organizational impact as it relates to nonprofit leadership and governance. And that's what brings us to the vision here, the vision where we see a world where every social sector organization has the leadership it needs to fulfill its mission and advance the public good. Now, we believe that it is impossible for the social sector to accomplish these objectives of fulfilling their mission and advancing the public good unless it is committed to diversity, inclusion, and equity. And specifically what we mean when we say diversity, inclusion, and equity is the following. Diversity as it relates to board composition, in terms of the skill sets of your board members, the different areas of expertise, the lived experiences of board members. And what we mean by that is board members who, through their own experiences in their lives, might have special knowledge, might have special sort of personal knowledge and of the impact of the work that the organization can do. As an example, if you are a homeless shelter, having someone on the board who has perhaps experienced homelessness or has been near homelessness in their lives at some point could be helpful in terms of a unique lived experience that speaks to how the board can be that much more effective. And then last but not least, around cultural and ethnic background. We believe that it's really important to have to have true diversity in terms of cultural and ethnic background, because again, and we'll get to this in a moment when I share some data, the audiences that nonprofits are serving as it relates to the ethnic composition are often quite diverse. And if you don't have diversity in terms of the composition of your board, in terms of ethnic diversity, then you have the possibility, and actually the probability of having blind spots in terms of what your board sees and doesn't see, what your board sees as priorities that might be true priorities, but also might be somehow impacted by something else that you don't see. So we believe in diversity across the board in these various ways. As it relates to inclusivity, we're talking about building a board culture of trust, candor, and respect for everyone. And again, that goes with diversity from the perspective that as you have more diverse perspectives in the room, more diverse audiences in the room, the hope is the board builds a culture in which those differences are valued, and that there's candor, there's trust, and there's respect for everyone of all backgrounds. And then last but not least, we talk about equity focus in terms of how the board understands and develops strategies in the context in which it operates. What we're really saying here is that boards and organizations do not operate in a vacuum. That in fact, it's important for boards to understand, for example, the public policy environment that they're operating in, and to understand how they can advocate most effectively for the mission that they serve. This happens to be one of the areas that boards tend to be least effective in terms of advocacy, partly because I don't think boards have yet fully come to terms with how they can be effective in that space and just are not always oriented that way. So that's just one example. Public policy environment, understanding the history sometimes of the issues that you're dealing with, understanding the other key stakeholders and the influences that they have in terms of the overall sort of ecosystem in which the organization is operating, and then understanding those who are most impacted in the organization. And with those things in mind, making sure that the board and the organization are open-minded as it relates to having alliances, perhaps even doing strategic restructurings, that speak to the larger purpose of the organization. Thinking about the purpose first. What is it that we should be doing as an organization that serves the mission, serves the purpose that we have, and being open to doing things that speak to that purpose. As we go to the next slide, this is where I wanted to share some data. This is a little bit of a sneak preview from our upcoming study that we call Leading with Intent, that some of you may be familiar with. Leading with Intent is a study that we do every 2 to 3 years. It's our signature study. And in that study, we provide information about current board composition and practices and performance. It just kind of captures where things are going. What are some of the major trends? And I wanted to share, with regard to board diversity specifically, some of the latest data from Leading with Intent that we will be releasing a little bit later this year. As you'll see from this data, we've got a long way to go. Based on our data, and our data is collected from surveys that we give to organizations, chief executives, and to board chairs. That data indicates that about 86% of nonprofit chief executives are white. About 77% of nonprofit board members are white. About 21% of nonprofit boards are entirely white. 65% of those surveyed said that the board's composition does not really represent the demographics of the population served by the organization. And then 76% of those surveyed said that their boards don't really place a high priority on demographic diversity when they recruit board members. So when I pull back from this a little bit and think about takeaways from this slide and why I say we have a long way to go, what I take away from this is that organizational leadership is largely homogeneous in terms of being mainly white in terms of composition. Boards know that from the standpoint of composition, they don't really represent the diversity of the audience they serve. And boards, in the end, not only know it, but they also don't really do much to change it. They don't place a high priority on demographic diversity when they recruit. So when you have this sort of situation where you say, well, if we don't have much diversity, we know we don't have much diversity, and we don't do much to change it by recruiting in a different way, then that's how these results tend to sort of just become repetitive, and we don't see much change. If I were to show you the data from 2017, it's actually, this data actually is a little bit better in terms of diversity than it was in 2017, just slightly. But as you can see, it's still not what anyone would consider to be diverse in terms of what we'd like to see relative to the audiences that are being served. Let's go to the next slide. So understanding that boards are not that diverse, boards know that they're not that diverse, and they want to do more to become more, or they haven't done much yet to become more diverse. One of the questions I get most often is that people will approach me and say, I'm on a board right now, we want to become more diverse, but we don't know how to get started. We don't know what to do first. I typically send them this document. We actually have a PDF of this document, which we can make available to everyone on this call as well. But it shares these 5 questions to get boards started. And I think these questions are really well suited for board retreats or board meetings where you can really carve out some time to do some deep thinking and some really honest evaluation and assessment of where your board is with regard to diversity, inclusion, and equity. I'm going to quickly just name off these questions, as you can see here. First question we ask organizations to ask themselves is our organization's reputation being negatively or positively impacted by our board's current composition regarding diversity? Related to that question is the second one. If someone were to make assumptions about our organizational values based on our board composition, what would they be likely to think? In that question, we sort of presuppose that it's someone who doesn't know anything else about your organization. All they know is just your board composition. What would they be likely to think about your values? The third question, how well are we cultivating a deeper understanding of the community or communities that we serve and bringing their perspectives, needs, feedback, and priorities into our strategic boardroom discussions? This is getting at the blind spots issue that I brought up. If we're not bringing in voices from the community with their diverse perspectives, their feedback, the priorities that they see from their perspectives that are different, largely going to be different from those of a non-diverse board, well, then how well will that board really understand what's going on in that community? The next question, Are we ever at risk of making decisions without fully understanding how those decisions may affect those we serve? Kind of related to question 3 there. If you have blind spots, if you don't have all those perspectives in the room, well, how much of a risk are we taking on in terms of making decisions that are not fully informed? And then the 5th question is probably the biggest picture sort of question in terms of the vision of the organization. And that is, if we were to make a deeper commitment to diversity, inclusion, and equity, what would that mean for our mission, our work, and the people that we serve? So those are some questions that we often suggest boards start with, and then see where these questions take them. Some boards ask themselves these questions and find that they're all on the same page in terms of what they want to do to go forward. Sometimes these questions can also reveal that your board is in different places in terms of how it sees the relative importance of diversity, inclusion, and equity. And if that's the case, then hopefully this is prompting a deeper conversation that you would not have otherwise had. So we see it as a positive tool and resource, regardless of where your board is today. With that, we can go to the next slide, where I'm going to get into a little bit of a discussion around board recruitment strategies. Here, I think it's really important to develop an action plan and policies and procedures to address self-identified weaknesses. You can use a board recruitment matrix to identify those areas that you want to address. It's really important to set expectations up front with board members, especially as it relates to fundraising. You don't want to have a surprise with board members who don't necessarily understand the give or get policies that you may have in terms of what your expectations are for what each board member will need to raise. You want to make sure that as you bring candidates up for consideration to join your board, that they're comfortable with, that they have some level of comfort and experience on the prioritized topics of your organization. The next sort of the last 5 bullets here all speak to different approaches around recruitment. And I would say the key point here is the one that speaks to moving beyond regular channels for board recruitment. I spoke a few minutes ago about the fact that many boards are just not that diverse. And one of the reasons for that is that they're not really going beyond their inner circles to find board members. So we suggest things like posting searches on job sites that attract diverse candidates, diversityjobs.com, blackcareernetwork.com, or sites like that, or to use search firms that can help in terms of helping to seek out more diverse candidates. There are lots of connections that can be made with local chapters of ethnic, professional, and civic associations. Thinking about groups like the Hispanic National Bar Association, the National Black MBA Association, the National Black Chamber of Commerce. All of these national organizations have local chapters. And so you can work with those local chapters in your cities and your states and find individuals who bring the skill sets and the expertise and the ethnic diversity and lived experience backgrounds that you might be looking for. Then the last 2 points around engaging staff and engaging every board member speak to the whole idea that this should be a shared responsibility when it comes to board recruitment. Staff members very often, they are going to be closest to the work. So they'll be able to say to you on many occasions, well, we work with this person in the community all the time. This person really, we're impressed with him or her. We should look at them as people to bring on the board. It's also really important to engage every single board member. I think some boards sort of instinctively say, well, if we want to become more diverse, let's put this responsibility, let's put this task in the hands of the more diverse members of our board. There's nothing wrong with that, but I would say it should be every board member who has a role in this. Diverse members may have certain inroads for sure, but every board member should consider this his or her responsibility as well. It should be a board-wide organizational priority and task. As we go on to the next slide, I'll speak to retention, because when you think about board recruitment, recruitment without retention doesn't really get you very far. So with that in mind, I want to share some best practices around greater retention, starting with being really explicit about having written diversity policies, about levels of board diversity that you want to attain, about your expectations that every board member should be personally committed to the principles of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Those are the sorts of things that often go into written diversity policies. There should be a really detailed orientation process so that every new board member, and particularly those board members that are going to be adding more diversity to your board, every new board member should be positioned for success. Assign a mentor or a buddy to be the new board member's go-to person for any initial questions or concerns that he or she may not want to share with the full board initially. Be sure to provide equal access to leadership opportunities. What I mean by that is having new board members really assigned to committees immediately, showing that you really value their experience, their expertise, their skill sets. Not necessarily chairing a committee initially, although that might be the case for some, but putting them onto committees that really are key to the board's vision and priorities sends a message that you're not just tokenizing, for example, a person of color and saying, we're adding you so we have greater diversity on our board, but we're not including you in the work of the organization. It's really important to go beyond that sort of just adding them for name only, for appearances only, but really to go beyond that and say, we really appreciate the skill sets, the expertise, the perspective that you bring, and we're going to demonstrate that by having you immediately engaged in our work. Being aware and having careful attention to board social inclusion practices, really important here. Your board may have certain practices that it's been doing from a social perspective forever. Whether it's golf outings, whether it's getting together on Wednesday nights on the fourth Wednesday of the month, just making sure that as you bring new board members on board, particularly new diverse board members on board, that the things you're doing and at the times you're doing them are things that are inclusive to everyone. Don't do social activities at times when the new people on your board are not available to be there. Don't take on activities that don't appeal to everyone. Make sure that they're inclusive to everyone on your board. And then last but not least, as you bring new board members of color onto your board, ask them for feedback on how the recruitment process worked out for them. Identify the parts of the process that help them to make the decision to join. You want to keep those parts of the process, but also ask them to give you some feedback on those things that might have been barriers, things that might have made them hesitate to join the board, and determine how to do better next time for that next person that you're going to recruit, how to remove those barriers going forward. As we go on to the next slide, I've shared a lot here around some data and some tips around recruitment and retention. I want to share a little bit about some specific instances I've had in the field, because I want to really give you a feel for how these conversations can be somewhat sensitive and be kind of uncomfortable, but to also share with you that the sensitivity and the discomfort is part of the work. And these three examples, I think, bring that home in a major way. And I invite you to think about these examples, and they may even prompt you to think about how you would respond in these situations. So the first example here involves a one-on-one conversation I was having with someone who used to be the chief executive of a pretty major nonprofit, a white male. And he and I were sitting down. I've known him for some time, and he was saying, Jim, I decided to have racial equity training offered to my full staff 2 weeks ago. And it was going to be a 2-day training, and we did it. But I have to tell you, I was so angered by the first 30 minutes of that training session that I shut down for the next 2 days. And this is someone, again, who I know, a white man. And I said, you got to tell me what made you feel that way. I'm really curious to know what made you that angry. And he said, I was angry because the first 30 minutes of that training were all about history and, history of slavery and redlining of certain districts in the United States in the 1930s and all these things. And I felt like I was being blamed for things I had no control over. And I said to him, I said, again, someone who I know, I said, I'm sorry that you felt that way. And I'm sorry that you reacted in that way and that you shut down for those 2 days of training, because I think that was a real learning opportunity that you let go by because of discomfort with things that I think that are really fundamental to the training. When we talk about things like redlining as an example, where in the 1930s, the federal government basically legislated lack of investment in communities of color as it relates to housing and business and just sort of setting aside communities for disinvestment. It's important to know that sort of fact because, for example, about 75% of those communities that were redlined in the 1930s are still struggling today. And if you know that history, it can inform your work as a board to say, here are some of the root causes of the initiatives of the issues we're trying to resolve. And so my point on this is, don't let discomfort or anger even sway you from a learning opportunity, because the discomfort is natural No one is trying to blame anyone in 2020 for some of the things that are historical, but we are saying that some of these things that are historical are fundamental to the understanding of this work. The next question here was around, could we use softer terms than white privilege? I just don't want white leaders to be put off by the terminology. And what I said to the person in this case, and this was in a larger training session, my point to this person, who was another white man in this case, was to say, not to let discomfort with certain terms put us off from the actual training. My concern on something like this is that if we use softer terms, or we try to sort of use euphemisms on certain terminology, then we're sort of diluting the impact of the training. We can end up not getting the point across we want to get across because we're so concerned with having someone feel offended or put off. And so my point is, again, around this issue of comfort and being authentic and using the terminology that fits and being honest about it and just working through the discomfort through conversation and through continuing learning. The last question here came from a white woman who runs a nonprofit. She's a CEO. And she approached me during a coffee break during a training session and said, do we have to focus on diversity for our board? See, we're a nonprofit that focuses on beautifying the environment. We're not involved in affordable housing or economic development or education or health. Her point to me on this was, we're not doing this sort of hardcore community development work that's so important to communities of color. We're doing something that's really more about the aesthetics of beautifying the environment. And my point to her in this case was to say that as a nonprofit, when we think about our whole sort of sector and our vision for fulfilling our mission and advancing the public good is everyone. And everyone has an interest, and everyone should have an opportunity to be part of that mission and that leadership. And so no, you don't get to opt out of thinking about and acting on diversity for your board just because you don't have a mission that feels as core to the community as something else might feel. So my point to her was that no, I didn't want to give her that an out. And she wasn't asking it in a way that was offensive or hostile or anything like that, but she really was truly asking and just saying, is there a way we can get around this? And I just wanted to sort of shut that down, frankly, and just say, no, beautifying the environment is another important mission, and everyone should have access to being involved in that work. And you should not be sort of sloughing off on the importance of diversifying your board just because of that mission. With that, I'll go to the next slide. We're getting close to the end of my part of this conversation. I just want to point out here, I think it's really important for board members to lean into the discomfort in discussing these issues. As I've said a couple times already, it's part of the work, and you cannot get around it if you want to make progress. My second point for board members is just keep learning, and I've got lots of action verbs here around reading and watching and listening, noticing, connecting, engaging, acting, reflecting, and staying inspired. And these are not, I don't use these verbs by chance. This is actually related to something called the 21-day Racial Equity Habit Challenge, which is a 3-week sort of self-driven sort of tool that allows you to choose each day for 21 days, something you can do, whether it's reading an article, listening to a podcast, watching a TED Talk, all of which in some way speak to racial equity in some way. And so these are great opportunities, along with town halls and different things that are happening these days on Zoom, to just keep learning, keep expanding your perspective and your knowledge. And the last thing I'll say here is just acknowledge, I think it's important for boards to acknowledge that it's great to make statements and declare intentions, but that's not enough. It's important for boards to assess what they've done with regard to diversity and equity and inclusion, and then decide what they will do as they go forward. That's really what's important. The statements are wonderful, the declarations are great, but they're really only complementary to the work, and it's important for boards to focus on that work. With that, I will just close out with the last slide where I share a few contacts and resources. This is my contact information here. I wanted to share with you our Boardsource website. The second site that you see there that speaks to the research around critical issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion is a site that shares our perspective on this work, but also several tools, lots of articles, lots of research, some blogs I've been writing in this space as well. We will find all of that on that page. And then the last site that you see there is our COVID-19 page. We've done a lot of work since COVID began back in March to create Q&As and create and curate different articles and resources that speak to the key issues that organizations face during COVID, fundraising, the partnership between the board and the chief executives, any legal issues, strategic planning during a time of COVID. So I invite you to go to that site as well for any and all information that relates to COVID that might relate to your organization. With that, I will stop, and I am now happy to hand it over to Paul.
Jim, thank you so much. And I just want to share with everybody, just from our perspective at Philanthropy West Virginia, the great value of board sources. We've used them for many, many years for both my role as a CEO, a previous staff member of a nonprofit, as well as serving on the board of several groups. So just kudos, Jim, thank you, and as well as just the board sources, multitude of wealth of information and training. So I'm Paul Doherty with Philanthropy West Virginia, and I come with you kind of serving on different ends of the table, different perspectives, just kind of giving examples. I've had the honor of working for a board of directors, which I do now as the CEO of Philanthropy Leadership Network, but then also serving on boards, chairing, and as well as advising and consulting with boards. And these are just some of the organizations I currently work with in the past year or past 5 years. As I mentioned, Philanthropy West Virginia, I report to the board of directors. I serve on the boards of Leadership West Virginia and the United Philanthropy Forum. I'm co-chair of the West Virginia Impact Commission. And then previous groups I've served on the board with or served as chair is Generation West Virginia, the Governor's Council on Young Talent, and a variety of other nonprofit 501c3s. So just letting you know that I come from that different perspective as a staff member, CEO, board chair, founder, and or board member. So Robin, next slide, please. So just a little bit about Philanthropy West Virginia. We are a 28-year-old organization with our mission of strengthening philanthropy in the Mountain State. And so we are focused as a network, of philanthropic leadership network of givers, which is everything from private and family foundations to corporate giving to private donors, as well as a variety of those in the business of investing and supporting and advancing nonprofits. We have a clearly laid out mission, vision, and also core values. And these were done in partnership between our staff, our board, and our membership in the network that we serve. Next slide, please. So how do we do our work at Philanthropy West Virginia? And looking at the great resources that was shared with us from Boardsource is that we have worked with over 80 members, from small private family foundations to multi-county, multi-million-dollar community foundations to corporate giving. But we do it from a perspective in three major pillars. First is learning, and through a variety of professional development seminars. Everything, of course, this year is virtual, as many of you are experiencing. Second is leading, is working with the board members, the CEOs, the staff, the founders of the foundations, as well as the advisors on different policy and efforts that are needed from a standpoint of leading and supporting issues critical to our nonprofits and our communities in West Virginia and Central Appalachia. And then leveraging. We focus on the standpoint that local philanthropy, when they collaborate and work together, can leverage bigger resources and opportunity. And going on to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit from the perspective of how are boards leading and partnering. And this is a picture of a recent board planning session among my board of directors. Is that we build off the great focus that the Boardsource has, which of course the primary role of any board of directors is duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And we stress that through our orientations and trainings, and many of the members of my board also report to boards of directors. So like NAVSO, we are a network of individual grant makers who have their own board of directors to report to. And I translated a little bit more into govern, give, get, and guide. And knowing that it's a partnership between the board of directors and the staff, and that we're always all learning to become stronger and better. You know, the primary responsibility of any board from the standpoint of duty of care is the governance, is overseeing fiduciary responsibilities and best practices. And that is also looking from a standpoint of the representation on your board of directors. This photo actually comes from our planning session for Philanthropy West Virginia in February of last year, which was our process of having a very intentional discussion of strategizing around our equity and inclusion work, in particular, not just from a standpoint of board representation, but thinking systemically as to how foundations and corporations are giving to support communities of color, as well as thinking from a standpoint of our representation of our members' boards and how do we actually live that value of equity. From the standpoint of giving and getting, it's not just about the monetary amounts that help us. Many of us are looking for those board members who help us with revenue generation, but also giving and getting expertise, importance of counsel, resources for us, and guiding. Is that really, that's where that thought leadership and partnership space exists that allows for us as staff. We're a small staff of 3.5, serving all of West Virginia and neighboring states. And with that is we're looking for some of that guidance as we work through issues. And so as we go through from the standpoint of partnering is how we have during this pandemic. For example, during COVID, we had to lay out really clear objectives and goals because we have to make sure we sustain a 501c3 because we have revenue streams. We're not endowed like our members with large foundation endowments. Rather, during COVID, is we set up a regular communication process, and that is discussing amongst our executive committee weekly or every other week on what we're doing in response to the pandemic, our board of directors monthly, and that sometimes through emails and or phone call discussions, Zooms, which we're very pleased that for some reason in our foresight in December of last year invested in a large Zoom platform, which has become very helpful to us. But going back to those areas of govern, give, get, and guide, it has allowed for us to even talk about what are things that are most important to us that we had planned to do. We had great ambitions in December and January. The pandemic arrived. And so going back to that partnership side was having the conversation within the executive committee as well as the board to say, okay, what do we continue? And so one of those key issues was that we had already started work for 3 years on equity inclusion. We said, we know that during a crisis like this, needs, as well as the lack of resources for communities of color, for low-income communities, for a variety of different areas that we focus on in Appalachia will be forgotten. We have to lean into that and to work on that as a board and organization. So we constantly communicate as well as in that partnership from the guide standpoint. There's certain things we had planned for this year that we put aside. And so while it's frustrating to put things aside, it allows us to fine-tune our efforts. And so it's a constant conversation. And then also updating our board. We just had a board of directors meeting a week and a half ago where we talked about what our COVID response was, what our goals were, and just making sure everybody's on the same page. And one of our discussions has been continuing to make sure our board and our staff are diverse, and we're working as far as strategies right now on that. Next slide, please. So just from a standpoint of my second question, what are the goals and or growth you want to see your board achieve? Is that it's constantly evolving. From our standpoint at Philanthropy West Virginia, I'm sharing with you is kind of where our goals for our board's growth, diversification, as well as work was in 2011 when I came on versus 2020. So, I'm interested from the standpoint of, for those that are on the webinar today, is that if you serve on a board of directors, I'd be interested to see you flag it in the chat session or the Q&A just to put your hands up or just say, I serve on a board and what board do you serve on? In the perspective of me reporting to the Board of Philanthropy West Virginia, our work among them in 2011 when I first came on was to go from a surviving organization. We were very challenged financially, diversification of board members, diversification of revenue streams. So our board was very internal focused, saying we're going to move from surviving to thriving, make sure we start actually have a profitable year for once and retain our membership. We were about 40 members back then, as well as be aware that we had a very big gap in our board's diversity. We had a strong, previous dominating feature of a certain type of members on our board, which were older professionals who were white in the space of philanthropy, primarily community foundations. We set a goal is to start moving in an area to diversify many elements, not just racial diversity, but also gender diversity, geographic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, age diversity. The other part was back then we looked at it from the standpoint that we were a membership organization, so just kind of a trade association that we had some members. And then through the hard work of the past 9 years, thanks to a collective effort of our team, our staff team, and our board of directors, is that our goals for our board are much different. Is that at the heart of our work, we're talking about diversity and inclusion at all levels, making sure that from the standpoint of board of directors has diversity, we have different perspectives within our membership, as well as from the standpoint of the programming and services we offer. We are looking at revenue generation. It's a little bit different now, as we're now in a retaining standpoint. How do we always make sure we're promoting our mission? Our board members are helping with connections to think about how we're connecting with different populations that we're missing, being aware of the blind spots that we have in our work across the regions that we serve. And also being very careful on our board is a great advisor and guide from the standpoint of being aware that we're mission driven or mission centered and preventing from any mission creeping. We've had numerous programs and offers come to us during the pandemic of response to the COVID, as well as the financial implications. And many times we've had to say more no's than yes, not because we're concerned with the issue, but being sure to vet and make sure it's a fit for us. People offer money to do things, but then it sounds good, but in the reality, does it fit with our mission? And the fifth area is that our board of directors, our staff see us more as a philanthropic or philanthropy leadership network, where that means is philanthropy comes together around common issues and efforts to improve our communities, education, equity, as well as looking from the standpoint of economic viability. So, each organization can set up its own goals or growth and really identify from a perspective of where you go from there. My next question Hey, Rob, if you don't mind going to the next slide, please. Oh, example, actually. Sorry about that. Jumped ahead there. So one thing that's really great, and you heard Jim reference, using a rubric or a measure. This is a great tool, a simple resource that allowed for us to really assess our board. And this is something that the CEO or senior leadership, if you're a one-person shop, you and your board chair meet up and talk about your current board composition. This comes from Joan Gary Consulting, Nonprofits Are Messy blog. The link is available there, folks, but in a board of directors assessment tool. It's thinking from the standpoint of each board member, who's actively engaged, how are they encouraging, how they're contributing to the work of the organization. Thinking about whether they're committed to the organization or more of what they get out of it, their level of participation in programs, meetings, and activities. Then thinking about their ability to help contribute the revenue side of the organization. And then also talking about the values and work above and beyond. Within this is that also gives a leadership potential. And so this is a great way to look at your existing board and think about, you created your list of priorities across there. And I can give you an example to the next slide of how we do it in our shop, is that we look back and working with our board, okay, what are the priorities going back to our values? And so we identify, are we an inclusive space? Are we a sustainable organization? How are we stewarding our resources, our investors, our partners? Membership, because we do have membership as a part of our work in public policy. You heard Jim talk about a lot of the efforts of nonprofit boards. They don't realize the power they have in the public policy space, and public policy is one of our 4 focus areas. And then governance. And so for each board member, I do this internally, I don't share it widely, but work with our board chair and discuss with our staff is, as we are reviewing our current board structure, is thinking about how are we doing this work collaboratively, what values and what diversity do they contribute in the spaces that are priorities for us. An example is I have a past board chair at Philanthropy West Virginia who's great about sustainability, looking at stewardship and membership and public policy and governance. But the one key part of it, when it came into the deeper role of sustainability, of asking them to help raise resources financially, contribute, wasn't much of an interest to them at the time. And when I came to find out is that that individual absolutely loved to steward and say thank you to people, as well as they were aware of their privilege, and they were very clear to help recruit a diverse board for us as we identified where we had gaps in our representation. So knowing that not every board member, if you make your own, it's not going to check every box in this list or rank them, but it's going to give you an option for you to kind of figure out what is important to you as you go along. And it's a great way just to go back and review and think about how they contribute to governing, giving, getting, and guiding. My final question for everybody for today is, what do your boards do well or will do well? And I always say, when you set goals, we as an organization set goals, not just for staff, but also board goals. We do a board self-assessment each year. We build it actually off of a model, I believe, from Boardsource, that allows for our board and staff to evaluate the board, just like the board evaluates me as the CEO And then I evaluate the staff with the model that we have in place. And then from there, we identify our top 3 things of what we want to do better for the year ahead. Now, of course, this model is a bit different now. And knowing that you set your goals based upon your size, your focus, and your stage of life. I gave an example earlier of how we were in 2011 versus 2020. Back when I first came on, it was a staff of 1, and it was a working board, a board where a lot of the board members helped do things that staff would do. But as we built capacity, we're more in a directing board space now, where the board's involved in committee chairs, helping out with specific projects and initiatives, but there's less, I guess, task work and more thought leadership and development work, not from a revenue development, but just from a standpoint of organizational growth. And then from the governing board. And in this time, we're asking a lot of questions of how boards are structured. Think about how you're sparking new evolutions and innovations in your work. Because the key part of this is you want to set goals. And just because you have statements and plans, just like Jim mentioned earlier, you got to act upon those. And as you act upon those, track and celebrate the progress of that work, and then reflect on it. It helps you grow. But those are just some things to build off of the great work that Boardsources is doing, how we applied some of that at Philanthropy, West Virginia. And as you set goals, especially during this pandemic, as our goals for our board in January and February from our planning session are completely different now in September. And so I look forward to answering any questions, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thank you so much, Jim. Jim, if you want to join us on the webcam, we'd be happy to have you for our Q&A section. So much goodness from both of you. I just thank you for sharing your insights. And in this time of a global pandemic and a national awakening for racial injustice, this conversation is so important about the critical role that our leadership plays to help guide each and every one of us every day. And certainly within the military community, we are trying to figure out, how do we do this better? We know we have a role to play, and we have some opportunities to have some tough conversations. Certainly at NAVSO, we've been hosting discussion conversations around DEI and how we can do this better at organizations. And we just keep telling everybody, like, get comfortable being uncomfortable, and, just this is how we grow. And so unless you're feeling uncomfortable, you're almost not doing it right, which is essentially kind of what we've been sharing with everybody. So again, to our participants, if you do have any questions, feel free to put those in the questions box, and I'll be sure to pass them along, or at least follow up with you after the section if we don't get to everything. But one of the things I did want to ask you, and maybe I'll start with you, Jim, is just a question around, like, we think of our board members as, or I mean, maybe just a stereotypical thing is like a board member, we knew wealthy people that are of like influence and affluence. Like, how do we get around this, especially as it comes to give or get policies to ensure it's more inclusive and that we're seeing value from everybody? Because I think people really struggle with this mentally in their heads. What does this really look like?
Sure, yeah. Great question. And I think that question sometimes comes to me from the perspective of board members who feel like fundraising is sort of the end-all be-all, or at least have traditionally thought that way. So that if you have board members who are able to meet those or exceed those requirements around give or get, that we feel like, well, that's, as long as we're getting the money in, and that board member is doing his or her part. And I think one of the things we want to be clear about from a Boardsource perspective is that the responsibilities of a board member are much more than around just fundraising, and that if you're getting, and someone may be raising money, but there's so many other ways that board members can contribute. Just on the issue of giving, not everyone has the personal funds or the network in their sort of social network to access X amount of dollars that may be a sort of a hardline give or get policy. What we often recommend is that organizations, if they're going to have a give or get policy, is that they have a policy that says that each board member should try to give at a level that is significant to him or her, and so that it's not a specific dollar amount for each person, because not everyone sort of has equal capacity in that space. But there are other ways to give, and actually, Paul, your example of the person who was so interested in the stewardship side and saying thank you and sort of doing that work around the relationship building mean, there's value in that as well. And so I would just, Kelly, to your question, I would just say that often it's just important for boards to recognize that fundraising is important, but the advocacy work is important, and all the other responsibilities of board members are important. And it's just important for boards to recognize and capitalize on the skills and the capacity that each person brings. And if you do that, then you'll have a board that's sort of optimized in how it operates.
Thanks, Jim. Yeah, Paul, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, and I think one part I should clarify from Tim, when I talk about give or get, it's also the lived experience. If people can give and share their experience in the community that they represent, they might not be contributing financially. From our standpoint, we do a lot of work in very rural, some people call it frontier still, but rural parts of Appalachia where there aren't that many, financial resources, but they bring the perspective of what are the challenges locally and how do we work together to collaborate and build up resources. So they might not be able to contribute. It's equal sacrifice, as Jim mentioned, if they want to financially contribute, but their knowledge and expertise of local community, and even on the policy side, they might know the state senator who chairs a committee because they grew up in the same county and they want to give their time to connect with that person to do something right. So I want to be very clear from the give and get. From our perspective is we believe in integrity-driven partnerships, and so that's where it's that intellectual giving as well.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And so a follow-on question to that a little bit. I think you guys have touched on this a little bit. Just want to hear your thoughts to this question is, how do you balance the type of board memberships or like board with the good old boys network, so to speak, in helping their network over the best interest of the organization? Do either of you have tools or examples that could help somebody maybe navigate that sort of situation, which we know does happen?
Yeah, to navigate the situation where the current composition of the board is, as you say, that sort of the good old boy network sort of dominates the current composition.
Move beyond that to get them to be more open.
Well, I think a couple of thoughts. One is that it's really important for boards to be thinking long-term in terms of, for example, maybe today the board composition is the good old boy network that you mentioned. But if you're looking at term limits and you're saying, okay, 6 months from now, we're having someone term off, one of the good old boys is terming off. A year from now, 2 more are terming off. Then it's important for boards to be intentional about thinking, okay, 6 months from now, let's not wait until a week before the person's terming off and then say, we're in a rush to bring someone else on, which might lead you to go right back to the same old network because that's the closest network based on the tradition of that board. But be intentional of thinking months ahead, or even years ahead, to say, okay, we've got these positions coming up. Let's be intentional about saying for the next 2-3 board slots, let's really be intentional about increasing our diversity, and so that it's not just a one-time thing, and it's not just an episodic experience, but that we're changing the way we go about recruitment long-term. And so you can't really flip a switch necessarily and say we're going to turn our board over, overnight. But if you're intentional about it, you can make change happen fairly quickly and fairly significantly. I sit on a board right now. I've been on a board of a local homeless shelter for the last 3 years. And when I joined that board, I was the second person of color who joined it. We're 3 years later now. I was the second out of about 15 people on the board. Now 3 years later, we're 7 out of 15 are people of color. And that has happened because we've known when people's term limits are coming up, and we've been really intentional about thinking about how we would recruit going forward. And it's been done in a different way. Some of the ways I mentioned on this conversation, so that it's changing. I wouldn't say we're there yet in terms of our comfort levels in talking about diversity and all those things. I think we still have work to do as a full board, but the composition has dramatically changed over the course of the last 2.5, 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
I think also bringing outside experts, to come and talk and compare, opportunities. So, for example, because we are a learning space, we're a professional network that trains people. We have been using our annual conference and programming to really educate the broader membership of the importance of diversity and inclusion. And first, we started off by bringing in our peers from the Washington, D.C. peer group to talk about their own efforts on putting racism on the table as a series. That opened up the conversation about, an individuals 3 or 4 years ago when we did that work didn't see the connection. West Virginia has a lower percentage of a diverse population. I think it's 8% of our state's population is diverse. And, people were, well, it's not really a fit for us. But as they heard through the experiences and the programming, the outside voices, and then bring it to our board level as well as our membership level, they started understanding the issue more. And I'm very honored to see that many that were a little adverse a few years ago during this year have become incredible advocates for the importance of this work. It took them time, it did take a national part, but bringing in people from other groups to the older good old boys network to kind of hear how it's changing. We're also dealing with in our state an issue of we've had a massive loss in younger population. And so our board's dealing with, we need to really ramp up the next generation of leaders. And so it's been an opportune time for us to say, all right, let's look at what do we shape this organization, still engage, traditional leaders or the old school leaders, but then also building that up from there. And so having the outside speakers, bringing in over time, as well as, importing it into your board planning sessions and, having those expertise really has helped us to evolve to where our board fully embraced equity inclusion as a priority in our work. And now we're moving forward with kind of a learning agenda for that.
Yeah, thank you so much to you both. I think you also shared a really critical tool that can help. We both talked about those rubrics to talk about kind of the diversity, equity, inclusion, among your board, both in skill set and all sorts of different things, and how important that is. And so we'll make sure we follow up with our registrants with all those resources, as well as those will be critical to really elevating your performance. What about just quick thoughts on board size, right? Would it be, could you quickly add a couple new board members, or is that inefficient? Because you talked about timing people off, if you start implementing policies. Could we intentionally add a couple extra board members, or like how big is too big before we move on?
Yeah. We don't have a lot of hard and fast rules about sort of how big is too big, but I'll answer your question in this way, though. I would say to the idea of adding more than one person at one time, I think that can be great, particularly for those boards that are just starting to become more diverse. Rather than bringing on one person, let's say, who was maybe the first person of color joining the board, by bringing on more than one person, bringing on, let's say, two in this example, that also sends a message that it's not just a one-time sort of token situation where the person feels like, oh, I'm the one person who's of color on this board. They're just doing that for appearance's sake. Whereas if you make a commitment to more than one person at one time, for one thing, they can be supportive of each other and in their journeys as new board members of color on this board. But it also is a greater commitment that the board is truly a greater commitment that the board is making and that the organization is making. So from that perspective, I think to the extent that there's room to bring on more than one at one time, absolutely.
Great. Any final thoughts, Paul?
I would just, if you have a governance or a nomination committee, I think really having that discussion of the rubric with them and looking at, as Jim mentioned, the terms that are expiring or renewing, but then also adding on additional seats. And we're currently going through that with our board of directors right now. So actually, we have a governance committee meeting next week. And really think about the additional seats. Fully agree that as you bring in, we call them classes, as you bring a new class of members in, because they're usually 3-year terms, is really looking from a standpoint of not just token additions, but really adding in those elements, but then making sure that you look at each class and it's planning ahead. And what is the next group of individuals being invited? Because we work people through committees. We get them involved from a committee level and see that their experience and energy for the work. And then that says, definitely let's put them on the board. So that's another part that I would just suggest is don't look at it just a board diversification, but your committees, your presenters. If you have a panel, make sure the panel is not just a bunch of old white men. Make sure it's a diverse group of people. That needs to be applied across all spectrums of your organization's work.
Yep.
Excellent points. Well, and I know Emily and Jeanette, I promised to follow up with you directly on your questions. There's still good ones in the queue, but we are getting to the top of the hour. And I just wanted to say thank you so much, Paul and Jim, for sharing your insights here. You clearly are a wealth of knowledge, and we appreciate you sharing this time with us. For everybody on the line, I did put the link for our survey. We desperately need your feedback and love to hear from you. A couple upcoming events next week. Our partner, Stanford Institute of Philanthropy, is hosting an event on redesigning your next event or campaign in this virtual world. So sign up for that one. Don't miss that. And the Military Influencer Conference is coming up virtual on November 10th. More information will be coming about that soon. We're also interested to host our next virtual discussion and would love to hear for your thoughts on where we can lead you in that area. So feel free to send us a note. And thank you all for joining us today. Again, thank you, Paul and Jim. That concludes our session, and we're grateful for your time. Have a great afternoon. Bye, everyone.